Hey, welcome everybody. I'm doing my own catering here. I'm Alec Baldwin, and I am the president of the board of Guildhall. And I want to have a special thank you. Is Andrea Grover? Where are you, Andrea? Here she is. A thank you to our executive director, Andrea Grover. And to our board president, Marty Cohen is here. Are you there, Marty? Wave to everybody. Marty and his wife, Michelle. This is the third and last of our series, the Hamptons Institute, a program that we resurrected. It was a program that was created by Marty's predecessor, Mickey Strauss. And when Mickey passed away, this kind of went to sleep for a while, and we resurrected this program last year. We had tremendous success. And again, this year we had a very, very good season with our programs about global warming, about Trump and the Constitution, with wonderful panelists on all these shows. And this is our last program about ideology versus fact, the new normal in news. And very briefly, I'm going to sit down. Very briefly, I'll mention that, if you're like me, I grew up, I was a news junkie, but from when I was 10. Because when I was 10, the Vietnam War was raging. In 1968, when I was 10 in 1968, Nixon was like Dracula, got out of the coffin, pulled the stake out of his heart, and became president of the United States. Robert Kennedy was killed, King was killed. The Chicago Convention, 1968 was the year that I just was glued to the TV, the drama of the news. And yet at the same time, facts. I wanted to know what was going on. And as we're going to talk about with our wonderful panel, I'm very grateful to all of them for coming out here this evening. The prioritization of that news, what matters and what doesn't matter, what's important. What's the lead story in the Times? What's the lead story in the evening news? And now, the internet's made it all kind of a big buffet table. But what matters and what doesn't matter? What do we need to focus on? And what are we best ignoring and leaving behind? But I want to talk about that with our guests in a historical perspective, because they all have had very, very long careers and wonderful and diverse careers in media. Please help me welcome Bob Garfield. Come on out here, Bob. From On the Media. Amy Goodman. You're going to sit here, Bob. Amy Goodman. Sit here with me. I'm sit here. From Democracy Now! And Nicholas Lemann, the Chairman Emeritus of the Columbia School of Journalism. Thank you. Now, we talked backstage, and I wanted each of you to take a moment, and we'll start with Nick Lemann, about the, when do you recall it was different? When do you recall in your life there was fairly reliable integrity in the news media? And what were the first signs you saw when you saw it changing on a critical level?
Oh, okay. Well, I think first, all of us panelists can agree that we're about 39 years old or so, right? Anyway, we're roughly the same age, unspecified. But what we grew up with, the main thing is it's a pretty atypical period. It's not like, there was normal, there was baseline, and then very recently everything went crazy. Everything in journalism was pretty crazy through the 19th century and much of the 20th century. In the 19th century, the journalism was mostly funded by the major political parties. Every town would have a paper called the Democrat, a paper called the Republican. They have different versions of reality. In the early 20th century, I asked my students this and they draw a blank, but maybe somebody here has seen the front page, right? So is that objective journalism being portrayed there? Maybe not. That's sort of spirited commercial journalism, which prevailed in maybe the first half of the 20th century. Then there was this kind of moment, I would say roughly, end of World War II through about 1980, when there was a sort of calm. There were 3 broadcast networks. There was one big newspaper in most towns, and there was this idea of, the sort of genteel, fact-based media establishment. And then, boom, that's not the world we live in anymore. When did I first see it change? Everybody will have a different answer. I think something that I, as a journalist, didn't notice much at the time, but a big change in retrospect was when President Reagan's FCC chairman, Mark Fowler, deregulated broadcasting. When Alec Baldwin, little Alec, was sitting with his dad watching the Huntley-Brinkley Report at night, that was a very regulated industry by the federal government. And you know, we had the fairness doctrine, we had the equal time rule, and you weren't allowed to do hot-blooded ideological, at least on the airwaves. And when it was deregulated, the ideological thing was let loose and the commercial thing was let loose at the same time. So if you remember, all three networks abolished their documentary units within like 5 minutes after deregulation. And the networks became more commercial and the non-network sector became much more ideological. So that's when I would date it from.
Amy.
Well, I can't quite go back to the 19th century, but I'll just go a little more, I'll pick up where you left off, but more recent, because I don't think this is just about, having this extremely ideological network, Fox, that has driven things sort of off the cliff. I look at all the networks, and let's look at, for example, the time of the lead up to the Iraq War. Before I go any further, I just want to say, me and my team at Democracy Now! Just came on the jitney, and we drove through the eclipse. So we're still experiencing this. And there was this funny social meme that's been going around on social media for the last week. It said, "Dear God, please show us a sign if you want Trump impeached, like blotting out the sun or something." So this was a very interesting experience for us today. So I'm still kind of recovering from this. And I was the only one on the jitney that had the special glasses. So all of us on the jitney got to look up at the sun as we drove here. So it has been revealed, the eclipse. We'll see what happens from here. But I do want to go back to 2003. Not just Fox, NBC, ABC. The group FAIR, right before the invasion of Iraq, did a study 6 weeks before of the 4 major nightly newscasts. So this was NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, and the PBS NewsHour. 6 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, when General Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, 2 weeks around the time, February 5th, 2003, when he gave that speech for war at the UN, that really was the nail in the coffin for so many, because Colin Powell had a lot of credibility. He was dragging his feet on war, and when he said that the proof was in that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, he himself says that that speech is a blot on his career. But FAIR looked at the 4 major nightly networks. At this time, 6 weeks before the invasion, about half the population was for the war and half against. So there were 393 interviews done around war in that 2-week period on these 4 major nightly networks. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders, peace leaders? What do you think, half, something like that, 200, 150 maybe? 3. Only 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media, and that didn't even include Fox. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. And I think this very much laid the groundwork. And it's significant that we're gathered here tonight at Guildhall on this Monday night when President Trump will give a teleprompter speech talking about his plans for Afghanistan. And I'm actually not holding out much hope. I mean, obviously, we know where Fox will go, but MSNBC, CNN, when it comes to war, all of these networks circle the wagons around the White House.
Why do you think that is?
There is a kind of unquestioned, although the media, and we were talking about this in the back room, I think I'm always astounded now, the way the media has stood up, talked about the importance of a democratic media, essential to the functioning of a democratic society, that we're supposed to hold those in power accountable. It's like all the media has become Democracy Now! Is what we've been saying for 21 years. But the reason they're doing that is because Trump is directly, very personally attacking them. And they're defending themselves, as they should be defending themselves. I've always been amazed at Trump on this, because he's very media savvy. Why doesn't, and Alec will have to explain why he does what he does, but why doesn't he hold off on the media for just a week? Stop attacking them directly. The establishment media tends to embrace and protect the establishment. But because he's hitting them so hard directly, they are countering him in a way that we've never seen, that is extremely admirable, except when it comes to war. And this is why, look, he had his worst week ever this week. And so tonight, it makes perfect sense, as we saw in the last few weeks, because every week seems to be the worst week he's ever had. You then see this moment where he says he's going to attack a country, right? You have North Korea, fire and fury. And before that, I mean, in the first few months of the Trump administration, you had him dropping the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world on Afghanistan, the Moab, what the Pentagon has dubbed itself, the mother of all bombs. A radius of a mile across. Bush developed it, didn't use it. Obama didn't dare use it. And President Trump, within a few weeks, he drops this bomb inexplicably. And right before that was the bombing of the Syrian airfield. How did the press respond? I just had to quote, not Fox, but MSNBC, right? Brian Williams, when the bombing of Syria happened. This was quite a moment, and I think Leonard Cohen is rolling over in his grave, but you may remember I was watching at that moment when he said this. When, not Trump, but Brian Williams said, "We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, 'I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.' And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield." And he goes on from there. Glorifying war at the time when the media was fiercely opposed, when it comes to domestic issues, when it comes to white supremacy here at home, when it comes to so many issues, healthcare, absolutely critical. But when it comes to war, all of them together circle those wagons.
Because of 9/11, because of an...
I think it goes back way further.
We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to it. By the way, you just killed any chance of us getting Allison Williams to come here and do a celebrity autobiography, but go ahead.
You never know what daughter is actually
Amy, it's okay. Amy, bring it on, Amy. Bring it on. Bob, what changed in your lifetime? You forgot the question.
I don't care to comment. I just... first of all, I have to correct you. It's not the back room. It's the green room. The back room sounds like something sinister was going on in there with cigars and
what's the back room?
gerrymandering.
You said you
were sitting we were in the back. It's not important. Never mind.
Very good. Yes. Okay. Green room, even if it wasn't green.
It was kind of a beige meadow, kind of.
We call it parchment. It's a parchment
It's a
color.
parchment. This has nothing to do with the question, but just one thing about Brian Williams. He is an extreme example of what the media are kind of writ large. I mean, he for whatever reason, goes priapic whenever artillery is discharged. And you know, kind of the apotheosis of what is not only common in the media, which is this kind of awe and reverence for war when American troops are involved, but a society which in the past 40 years has gone, you know, it's made a lot of surprising changes in its worldview, as society as a whole. And one of them is to embrace this cult of military, which has affected the media at times when, you know, war seems to be in the offing. And some of it has to do with the notion that the media have this liberal bias, and I think that this is a reflex, this kind of rally around the flag, almost sometimes jingoistic response that makes us show that we are not enemies of the people, but rather we're all playing on the same team. And if the President of the United States says, this will not stand, well, then it will not stand. And off we go, and just completely suspending our disbelief, which I think is substantially how we wound up in the Iraq War. It's a surrender of disbelief, partly motivated by not wanting to be perceived as some sort of sinister fifth column, but rather a loyal fourth estate. So that's that. When did things begin to change? I think, in that brief period during the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, when journalism began to become kind of professionalized in a way that it had seldom been before. And there were certain norms, certain canons. Yes, there was a kind of politesse, and there were things that we did not report, and we made a lot of the same mistakes institutionally that we continue to make today. But journalism had turned professional, and partly because of things like the Fairness Doctrine, even though individual newspapers were owned by fairly ideological oligarchs, the national media played it pretty much straight down the line. Then came the end of the Fairness Doctrine, and then came the freedom for the networks to turn news divisions into an entertainment profit center, and then came cable, which had no responsibility to play anything down the middle, and it looked at what was happening in right-wing radio across the country and realized that there's gold in them thar hills. And along came Fox, and they found and kind of coalesced what had been a gathering right-wing media conspiracy, and turned it from a political sector of the economy to a business sector. I mean, from a political sector of the society into a business sector of the economy, and it's just grown from there. Never mind Fox. What is about to happen with Sinclair, will make Fox seem, trivial. Actually, come to think of it, I have lost track of the question.
We'll come back.
Oh yeah, when did it all start? I can answer that definitively.
Looking back on your career,
before.
When was there integrity, and when did you first notice that critically?
I remember in the mid '80s seeing a bumper sticker that said something along the lines of "Dan Rather is a liar," and to me that's a line of demarcation when a lot of fringe right-wing media, whether it was the Spotlight from the John Birchers or a few talk radio hosts or the likes of Joe Pine from TV in the 60s and a few right-wing columnists, it coalesced into a beating heart of conservatism that eventually metastasized into Rush Limbaugh and Fox.
Yeah, but interestingly, do you remember that the radio thing is behind, in the background there behind Fox as well? What were you going to say, Nick? I'm sorry.
Oh, this is just minor on the war question. That's been going on forever. Arguably, the moment that people realized that media was a commercial business in the U.S. was the moment that Hearst and Pulitzer were competing to promote the Spanish-American War. And, there was huge cheerleading for World War I, World War II, Vietnam, for the first several years. It didn't turn until well into the war. So I agree completely with Amy. I was there covering Washington at the time for the New Yorker, and, the cheerleading for the Iraq War was shocking and shameful, but it was the most recent iteration of a pattern, which is this cheerleading for war, driving up ratings and so on.
And often the networks are bringing you the spectrum of opinion between the corporate Democrats and Republicans in Washington, the legislators, the Congress members, the senators. And when it came to for example, the Iraq War, think about the debate on the eve of the Iraq War. You had Hillary Clinton, Senator of New York, who gave a very impassioned speech about why people would be opposed to that war but ultimately concluded in that same speech that she would be voting for the war. So that was the spectrum of opinion. The Democrats who painfully voted for the war, and the Republicans who voted for the war.
So I have to tell one quick story. It'll be really quick. The debate was going on. Okay, so I was covering Washington. I went to the Senate Press Gallery. I was the only reporter in the Senate Press Gallery. Dick Durbin of Illinois was making a very eloquent speech against the war. Then Byron Dorgan of North Dakota comes into the press gallery and says, "Come outside, we're changing the subject." Literally said that. And I go outside, and he goes, there's all these flip charts, and he says, "Let's talk about the budget. Don't think about the war resolution," because they were terrified.
And the networks have to go outside of that small spectrum of opinion, because the fact of the matter is, I don't think most people stand right there. I mean, I think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about the growing inequality in this country, who care about racial and economic justice, who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back.
Now, your work in your career, Amy, and on Democracy Now!, you cover, as you mentioned in an email we exchanged, you cover a lot of movements, a lot of social movements, and you believe that the mainstream media doesn't focus enough of their attention on these kinds of social movements. And one in particular, because you spent a lot of time covering Occupy Wall Street, and I want you to, each person to give their own take on this, but I want to begin with Amy, which is that sometimes I look at the war thing, I look at the war issue, I don't recall that drumbeat for war in Vietnam as clearly as you do, because I was much younger, and so were you actually. But I see.
We were all.
And Sue, yeah, I was 10, you were 30 back in 19.
We came from two towns apart from each other in Long Island.
Where were you from?
Bayshore.
Oh, you're from Bayshore.
I don't know if we played you in tennis, but I think I might have beaten you. I'm not sure.
First of all, Bayshore is not 2 towns away. It's a couple towns away. Or townships, maybe you're right. And you played me in tennis? Where?
I'm kidding.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I never
at
thought
the juvenile
this could get
diabetes
this
tennis
ugly.
tournament.
I just never thought it would come to
at
this.
the old Forest Hills Tennis Club, the old West Side Tennis Club. We really are dating ourselves here. Anyway, but my point is that one of the things that I look at, I mean, the war thing, we can go on and on. I sometimes feel that the media over time, they were beaten up about how they didn't support the troops. Not everybody, I can't say this is industry-wide, but they were beaten up over time about how they covered the Vietnam War and how Vietnam veterans came home and how they were treated as a result of the way the media treated the war. I also feel that in the world we live in today, many people have a kind of a spasm of patriotism that plays through the prism of the military because they don't have a dog in that fight themselves. None of their kids are in the military. None of their kids get drafted. The people that make war in Washington and the people that report the war in New York and in other media centers around the country, none of their kids are going into the military.
And the people who end up speaking out against war so often are the soldiers who come home.
Right.
They're glorified when they go, and they're silenced when they come home.
But what I want to mention about Occupy Wall Street is this idea that, I want to ask you, why do you think there wasn't one prosecution of a major banker as the result of the crash in 2008? Why?
Well, I mean, that's an absolutely critical issue, and let's remember that this was through the Obama years. And it's very important to look actually at the records from President Obama to President Trump when it comes from everything to letting the bankers off the hook and the fury that people felt across the political spectrum, to immigration, the millions of people that under the Obama administration who were deported. President Trump just continues that trajectory. But his rhetoric is extremely different. So while President Obama sort of covered this up by the way he spoke with respect, when it comes to the actual numbers, it was millions of immigrants who were deported. But I wanted to say one more thing on the military. Aside from all too often the Democrats and the Republicans that represent us in Washington brought to us by the military contractors, as are the networks. And we can't ignore this. Either the networks are being brought to us by the weapons manufacturers the oil, gas, coal companies when we cover climate change, the insurance industry, and I mean, how many ads are you going to see for drugs, the drug industry when we cover healthcare? If we don't change that, I certainly am not saying you have a network, you know, you have a corporate head calling a reporter, but it is a kind of climate that you don't basically question. Like on healthcare, the issue of Medicare for all rarely raised, even in MSNBC and CNN right now. I think it's very much a reflection of the climate there that that's not the kind of question you ask.
I don't think that's true. I don't think it's because it's suppressed one way from the top in any way.
No, I don't think. I think there's a climate.
It's that there's a conventional wisdom that has long since infected Washington and the national media. Certain things that we accept as articles of faith, and one of them was that single payer it will never gain traction in this country. Now, mainly through Bernie Sanders' campaign and the healthcare fiasco that we're undergoing now, and because of some of the failures of Obamacare, people are giving some thought as to the polls are showing that it's a larger number of people and legislators are beginning to embrace the notion. But I think the flaw in the media is that we draw certain conclusions like single payer is a non-starter or Trump can never possibly be nominated, that inform a whole lot of coverage before we discover that all of our assumptions turned out to be wrong. So, you know, I make a living criticizing the media, but I don't default to the notion of corruption. I default to laziness, habit, and kind of herd mentality, but not the notion that General Electric is making it really very hard for reason to speak.
It very much sets a tone, I think. I don't think censorship works in the United States where you have a corporate head calling up to the head of the network, and then the network says, we're not going to do that, although it occasionally happens. But much more insidious and much more subtle is that those people at the heads of the networks and the heads of these corporations have a shared ideology. And if you're a young reporter making your way to the top, you understand what's going to get you ahead and what isn't going to get you ahead.
You absorb it very quickly. I mean, I always have the same tired analogy. I always say these people come into these jobs, it's like baseball. When the third baseman fields the ball and throws it to the second baseman to get the double play, nobody had to explain it to him before the game was played. He knew exactly what to do when the moment arose. And that's what happens in media now. These people come there and they realize what to push. I mean, I think that everybody is chasing Fox. I think that CNN is chasing Fox. I think that MSNBC is, or they're chasing their demographic. They're chasing their audience. They want to. Williams was chasing Fox. Williams sat there and thought, how can I wave the flag during my broadcast and grab me some of that Fox audience? But Nicholas, what were you going to say?
I was just going to give a specific answer to your question about the financial crisis. Just two quick things. We could spend a whole other panel on this. One, a great undercovered story, in fact, almost completely undercovered. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which did a great job, I think. At the end of their work, they sent 19 names to the Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, of people they thought should be considered for criminal prosecution, and none of them was prosecuted.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think Holder was that weak?
Well, first of all, the president announced, I mean, it's not that it was quietly quashed. The president announced right out of the gate that for whatever reason, he said it was in order to focus on saving the world economy, to look forward, not back, and not for the Justice Department to get all involved in prosecutions of people. Because for one thing, we needed these people to dig us out of the very crisis that they created. So if we can take Obama at his word, he made a strategic decision not to invest a lot of prosecutorial time and effort putting these guys.
Don't you think he
behind
could have
bars.
shot one or two of them?
Well, the other thing,
Two
Alec,
tops.
that's important, and it kind of gets to your points about the economics of all this. A lot of what went on that caused the financial crisis was legal. It didn't used to be legal. It was made legal in the 90s and first decade of the 2000s. And those were not moves that the press mostly applauded this because we believe it's the conventional wisdom point. Government regulation is bad. we have to free our economy.
Glass-Steagall, all that
yeah,
stuff.
Yeah, all that stuff was taken away, and the result was a disaster. But it was what FDR made illegal to pull us out of the Depression. Later, much later, presidents made legal.
Now, let me ask you this, Nicholas, which is that, I try to avoid using this term fake news, because, in the media, that's a kind of a shuttlecock that gets smacked around all the time by people. But I want to ask each person here, what do you think fake news is? Give me an example that's really gotten under your skin individually. What's a story? And you sit there and you go, I understand that story. I know what's going on here. What is fake news to you? Because we were emailing back and forth. Your question was, why is there so much less real news than fake news? And is there anything we can do to increase the ratio of real to fake?
It's hard for me to think that it's not President Trump who's interrogating us right now, so I'm trying to deal with this.
Well,
Well, back.
Please, Amy, please. I'll call on you when I'm ready. It's Nick's turn now, okay? Amy, please. Fake news, Amy, fake news.
but seriously, all that bullshit aside, Nicholas, tell me, Nicholas, what's a great fake news story you've tracked recently?
So back in the mists of time of 10 months ago, fake news meant Macedonian teenagers sort of making up stories and making them go viral on the internet. And then everybody started adopting it, and now it's what Donald Trump calls the New York Times. But the story about the DNC staffer that Hillary had murdered, I don't know if you all know that she did things like that, but it's been covered up by the mainstream media. That was a really good one. And that had
pizza
a lot
parlor.
of play. The pizza,
Well,
that was
that's where
a
she
good one.
honed her skills to murder Seth Rich. She was practicing on children in the pizza parlor.
Yeah, in the basement of the pizza parlor, which had no basement, by the way. Right. What about you, Bob?
Well, I think it's what Nick said. It used to refer to actual fake news, and to me, that's still a pretty big category. The whack jobs, cynical whack jobs like Alex Jones pass along these conspiracy.
The Inquirer.
Years
ago.
Well, it's the Inquirer. Much of it is invented out of whole cloth, or takes nominal facts and just distorts it to just completely to an unrecognizable and often apparently indicting thing. But there is no there there. It's just phony, and it's used to stir up, in most cases, but not only, but not exclusively, but in most cases, a right-wing base which has a certain worldview, and it wants it to be validated again and again and again, no matter how preposterous. But as you say, the president has I think he would say, reclaimed the word. He certainly expropriated it, and now he uses it to describe anything that is in any way potentially critical of him or his administration. And he uses as his proof that there are anonymous sources and other sinister techniques by the media so they can simply lie with impunity. But I have to say, Alec, I don't think the biggest problems facing us as a society and as news consumers is the whole fake news issue. That is a mere symptom of much larger forces at work, and including an administration and 30% of the people who believe that the media are enemies of the people. That is a surprising.
Who do you hold responsible for that? If you care to.
Man, I wish I had a microphone in front of an audience. I think it is. I think it was inevitable. I believe that what we are seeing now is simply the inevitable result of 5 decades, not only of right-wing haranguing, but a very large portion of the population who, from the Civil Rights Act to Miranda warnings to prayer in schools to Roe v. Wade to LGBT rights to you name it, have seen their values and their idea of
White America.
American norms just taken away from them. And not only were they taken away, as we became a more European-like liberal democracy, they couldn't even crack jokes at work about it. And that, what they called political correctness and what I called the Bill of Rights seemed to deprive them of their birthright. And they've been seething about it for a long, long time. And because the society has made such pretty remarkable decisions over the course of 50 years, they have felt more and more marginalized in their own country, and along comes a demagogue to, set fire to this tinderbox of resentment, and boom, and the fact that he is depraved and will say anything for a moment of attention has done him no harm.
Well, also, and now I would add to that list, you talk about Roe v. Wade and the destruction of all their values, or the diminishment of all those values. I'd add to that things like, and I'm struggling to come up with another example, but things like rather trying to bring down Bush with the National Guard paperwork, and I'm pretty convinced that certain people fed Rather that documentation. That documentation was planted in Rather's office to trip up Rather and ensnare Rather and his organization, killed his career, ruined his career. And I can't believe that the CBS couldn't do the forensics on that paperwork. But now, Amy, it's safe to say you spent a lot of time covering and going to Dakota to cover the pipeline issue. And I'm wondering what some of the fake news in your mind that was birthed out of that situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think joining this issue of giving voice to social movements and the issue of fake news, the way the media can allow these ideas, questions about whether news is real or fake, to fester is when you just have the pundits on television. These pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. They can espouse, right? They can espouse anything. And so you can start to say, I don't believe what they're saying. But the way you challenge that is you go to where the silence is. You go to the places where people are most affected and you let them speak for themselves. And it's that authenticity that breaks through all the fakery. And I think that's certainly the story of the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline. If I could just share it for a few minutes, because it illustrates so many things. But 2 April 1st ago, a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who is a descendant of Sitting Bull, opened her property along the Cannonball River to the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, the $3.8 billion pipeline that would snake its way, taking fracked oil from the back-end oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And she and so many people said, no, we don't want this to happen. In fact, the Native Americans said, we just want to be treated like any North Dakotan. The people of Bismarck, the capital, said no. And so the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, wasn't being built there. Mandan said no, wasn't being built there. And the Native Americans said, we don't want it built here, but they weren't so lucky. So when she opened that property, it wasn't tens of people or hundreds of people, it was thousands of people who came. It was the largest unification of Native American tribes from Latin America, the United States, First Nations from Canada. And it was happening over 2016, the election year. Where was the coverage? It was this epic battle. And they opened up more and more resistance camps. We were covering it from afar, but then on Labor Day weekend, again, the height of the election, remember, in the general election debates, sometimes I can't even call them journalists, the media personalities, right, that you see on TV. In these general election debates, did they ask one question about climate change, let alone the Dakota Access Pipeline? Climate change, the fate of the planet. No. And yet you had all of this building. We went there Labor Day weekend, and we found this remarkable battle going on. Native Americans, with their non-Native allies, were protesting. They were deeply concerned. They didn't want to be called protesters. They were called water protectors, they called themselves, afraid that when the DAPL, the pipeline, was built under the Missouri River, the largest river in North America, that could endanger the water supply for 17 million people, they said, no, this is not a good idea. And so we covered them going through the back roads of North Dakota protesting. They would be met by a fully militarized sheriff's department with tanks, with automatic weapons, gassing them, tear gassing them, macing them. It was shocking, but we've seen this before, like in Ferguson, right? People's uprising against the killing of an African-American man by a white police officer. This is recycling in America today. You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan and you bring them home and give them to the police departments of the United States. And it is very important we take on this issue as well. So hundreds of people were being arrested. And we followed on that weekend, a holiday weekend, Native Americans going to plant their flags at an area they didn't even think was going to be excavated then. It was under court review. And a judge said, give me the map that shows where you think you have sacred ground. And the Native Americans said, okay. And the Standing Rock Sioux gave the map to the judge. He gave it to the Dakota Access Pipeline because you have to give it to the other side. And that weekend, the bulldozers came from afar and they leapfrogged over, the Native Americans believed, to the area that they had designated on the map to change the facts on the ground. It would be a moot point when the judge ruled the next week if they just started excavating there. And the people were horrified. Instead of planting their flags, they came up on the property. They stood in front of the bulldozers. Terrifying sight, these mega machines churning the earth that are so dangerous. And we just started filming. And the people stood up and the bulldozers pulled back. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed dogs, attack dogs on the Native Americans. They were biting them. We were interviewing people who were bleeding. They were biting the horses of the Native Americans as well. But the people kept moving forward, and they were able to push everyone back, and they drove off in everything from their bulldozers to their pickup trucks with their dogs in it. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with Native American blood. I mean, we interviewed Winona LaDuke that day, an indigenous leader from the White Earth Reservation, northern Minnesota. She said, Governor Dalrymple, the governor of North Dakota at the time, you are not George Wallace. This is not 1965. This is not Alabama. We are through. So we went home. That night in North Dakota, we put the video on Facebook of just what we had seen. It went viral within 24, 48 hours. There were 14 million views that would make any network salivate, right? So if they wondered, no one cares about climate change, hardly. And then on Thursday, the judge was going to rule on Friday. The governor called out the National Guard. It didn't look good for the tribe. And quietly, they issued an arrest warrant for me. Now, I didn't know this. The next day, Friday, we did our show in New York. I went off to the Toronto International Film Festival in Canada. I wasn't fleeing. I was there to speak about a film on I.F. Stone, the great muckraking journalist, who said to young people, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3, all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary. And so I was speaking, Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone was speaking because they were showing, or news organizations today that follow in the tradition of I.F. Stone. And the next day I was speaking at University of Toronto with all the people who were speaking the night before at the premiere. And in the middle of my speech, I get a text that says, you're under arrest. Well, actually it said, there's an arrest warrant that's been issued for you. And I didn't know, I thought this was some kind of gag, maybe someone in the audience sent it, but it was a North Dakota number. And I thought, okay, this is troublesome if it's true, because if there's an arrest warrant, I mean, you won't be picked up right away, but if you have to interact with police, FBI, border guards, they will take you. And I had to go over the border to go home. So I didn't say anything to the audience, but because I was afraid if I let this out, if the arrest warrant got into the system, I had to get over the border before it did. So I just said, could someone call a cab? And I raced to the airport, came home. I really felt this was a message to all journalists. Do not come to North Dakota, which is why we had to return to North Dakota. We did a few weeks later, calling the bluff of the authorities in October of this past year. And as we landed, the prosecutors announced they were going to quash the arrest warrant. I'll take 120 more seconds. And they said instead they were going to bring more serious charges against me, charges of riot. I mean, this was just outright harassment. I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, what does this mean? He said, it's not terrible. You just face a year in jail. So I said, well, what exactly is going to happen now? It was a Friday afternoon in October. And he said, you'll be arraigned Monday at 1:30, which gave us 3 more days to cover the protests. And that Monday morning, the show must go on. So we broadcast from in front of the Mandan courthouse and jail, where I'd have to turn myself in, where so many hundreds of Native Americans had been arrested. So the backdrop was the courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. And we interviewed the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Dave Archibald, and he had just been arrested. And I said, what happened to you? He said, it was low-level summons, but I was strip searched, he said, put in an orange jumpsuit and jailed. The pediatrician of the tribe, Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, strip searched, put in an orange jumpsuit, jailed. I mean, the humiliation of these people. At the end of the show, hundreds of Native Americans came to show solidarity. The timing, we were going towards 1:30, but a journalist was about to be, arraigned, so it was getting attention. And I mean, all of the networks, New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue magazine was covering this, Al Jazeera, BBC homepage, it was all about this. And there was so much pressure brought on the local authorities that they did something they had not done before, which was the judge wouldn't even sign off on the charges for the arraignment. But not only for me, for the Native Americans that were being charged that day, a number of them had their felonies and misdemeanors dropped. This is what happens when the media shines a spotlight in the right direction. I believe in reality TV, not Donald Trump's kind, but the kind that actually shows the reality of people on the ground. It cannot be refuted, and that's what we need in this country.
You're listening to Democracy Now!, broadcasting from Guildhall, with your host, Amy Goodman. I want to ask, Nick, what do you want to say? You wanted to interject something?
Yeah, just quick. We were talking about fake news. Let me take a second to talk about real news. If you're living in New York and you're obsessively following Donald Trump, you're missing one big thing, which is radical reduction in the real news sector in the United States. Our business, the people who get paid salaries to be reporters and go out in the field and find stuff, that's about half of those people have disappeared in about the last 15 years just because of the way the internet has changed the economics of journalism. In a nutshell, Google and Facebook took all the ad money from the newspapers, to make a long story short. That's a big fact that people need to have in their heads as they think about this.
Do you have a comment or I have a question for you? Can I go ahead?
Yeah, what he said, there are 2 existential threats facing journalism in the United States today. By far the lesser of those 2 is this moron in the White House. The larger is the collapse of the media economy. It is not trivial. It's not just that we have lost half the workforce of journalists. It's that we're going to lose the other half we're going to be halved again very soon.
As a result of what?
The digital economy. It has shifted the laws of supply and demand. It has created an endless, almost infinite reservoir of supply, and that has the corresponding effect on demand, and news organizations can't fetch the advertising revenue that they used to, plus their audiences are much smaller, so you multiply a small number to a smaller number, and you get a yet smaller number. It is apocalyptic, is what it is. And this is why we were talking about cable news and these pundit shows. There is no news on cable news. There's a bunch of people with preordained opinions talking about the news on cable news, and they bring very little to the conversation.
Well, I want a question for each of you along those lines, but that's the thing. I only thought that Fox grew and grew because it was a certain group of people who they needed their interpretation of the facts. They needed their news, if you will, pre-digested for them. They couldn't articulate it. I'm not saying that they were unintelligent. They just didn't, I want to be kind here, they didn't have that gift. They didn't have that skill. They needed someone to get in there and say, this is what's really going on here. But you realize now with organizations like MSNBC that the liberals are susceptible to the same thing. Now, I want to say, in order to get to this question, I mean, I had a job at MSNBC briefly, and we talked about this backstage. And you know, I'm well aware that there are gifted, and I'm trying not to be. I mean, there's a sliver of generosity here, but I really believe that there's very, very talented people. But you would never know that from the content of the programs that they do. I mean, this stuff is tripe. It is crap. The best thing we can do in this country, and I'll get to this point about, because I want to talk to you about the economics of the business and how you teach about that idea. And that is, we live in a country where, I'll never forget, some producer said to me once, we were sitting around a bunch of actors and we were reading, Hollywood Reporter or Variety or a review of an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. This is 25 years ago. And somebody says, this movie, what a piece of crap. And everybody's, there's like 6 actors sitting around bad-mouthing Schwarzenegger, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel, the content of Schwarzenegger's films. And this producer we were working for turned to us at this lunch table, whatever, and said, don't do that. And we all went, I beg your pardon. He said, don't do that. He said, when Schwarzenegger goes to work in this business, he takes 300 highly paid professionals in the motion picture business, the highest number. Big crews, union crews, Los Angeles, studio filmmaking at its highest in terms of the cost involved. He puts all those people to work. And when he's done, and his movies put hundreds of millions of dollars in the coffers of that studio, some percentage of that money is peeled off to go into the development division to develop the next movie you're going to be in, he said to me. He says, when Arnold Schwarzenegger goes to work, you wish him well. You keep your mouth shut and you wish him well, because what's good for Arnold is good for all the rest of us. And that's what's happened in the newsroom. When I worked there, and this is the story we've talked about before, when I worked at MSNBC, this woman said to me, Alec, we've all got mortgages to pay here. It was a woman, she said, we've all got mortgages to pay. She said, we all have kids in private school. We all live in New York. We used to have high-paying jobs in regular network news, and now we're on this cable station. And she said, and nobody is watching. She said, no one's watching. The numbers, all through some wizardry by the powers that be, they get all these carriage fees that these networks are like some poison pill that's absorbed in some cable package. My point being that we have a tendency to not want to say things that are going to cost people their jobs. Like, I want to turn to you and I want to say, whatever you do, don't watch MSNBC. Whatever you do, don't watch these shows where people are talking about the news. And I want to ask the 3 of you, your show, I'm going to begin with you. Your show is called On the Media, and I've listened to several segments of your show where you give it pretty good. I mean, you're very good, and you beat the crap out of some of these people on your show sometimes. It's very funny. No, go ahead. Let's have a round of applause for On the Media. It's a great show. It's funny, and you're smart. I mean, you're smart and funny. It's a great show. But
Hold it. It's not funny and smart. It's a very rare combination of transcendent humanity and raw erotic energy.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I said.
Go on.
Well, I want to ask each of you, beginning with you, Bob. What's your recommended media diet for people? What should people, I do my podcast, and David Remnick comes on, and he says, well, I begin my morning with the Times. The Times is the weather. I start with the Times, and that's what most media players tell me, that the Times is for obvious reasons. What's your media diet? What do you recommend other people's media diet be?
I know newspapers are dying, but there's this paper, not far from here in New York City. It's called the New York Times. It is fucking phenomenal. It is a daily miracle. And, that is my lifeline. Now, I make a living finding fault with things that the New York Times does, but by and large, it is a great newspaper doing great things. I actually read it twice. I read it online, where I'm sort of directed to go into certain places. And then I read it, again, I read the broadsheet version, where it's more serendipity. I turn a page and read something I didn't know about, something that I didn't know I cared about, but I do.
One is speed dating, and the other is a real date.
Exactly. But I'm sorry, just a slight detour. I want to talk to you about Standing Rock. No, I don't want to talk about Standing Rock. I want to talk to you about when you get your news. Another source of my news is just Google News, which is an aggregator. And the good news is it knows what I want and feeds me more from all over the world of the kind of content that I have shown a history of consuming. And it gives me more than that from many, many, many sources. Plus, I have very smart producers who read stuff and send it along to me. I don't have to consume the news. I have people for that. So that's the good news about Google News or Facebook or wherever whatever platform you get your news. The bad news is that it serves you news of the sort you already consume. And as the consequence, never mind Fox, never mind Sinclair, never mind MSNBC, we are all in our own filter bubbles. And if you do not actually go out of your way to seek perspectives that are different from your own, you will be stuck in this bubble and constantly having your worldview validated. Well, I agree with that. Well, you can say that again, which does us no good at all.
No good.
Most of what of my media diet is what you'd expect it to be, but I do want to add, per Bob's point, one site that I begin every day with and I really like for the reason you gave is Real Clear Politics, which has many, many subdivisions. It's run by people on the right, but it's a sort of aggregator of opinion journalism. For me, I live on the Upper West Side in Morningside Heights. I teach at Columbia University. I write for The New Yorker. I don't meet a lot of conservatives in my daily life. I don't know what conservatives are thinking, what they're up to, what political, things, actions are stirring, and I really feel like I have to discipline myself to go to a source that's going to be a kind of a warning system on what's happening in conservative America. And Real Clear Politics, I don't know if anybody here knows it, is quite good at that.
Before we get to Amy, for me, it's the Times, the Wall Street Journal, and online. You know what site I love? Reuters. I love Reuters' online site. I mean, it's just no varnish. It's just boom. Here's the top stories.
Great, and the Washington Post deserves a shout out as we're doing this too.
Fantastic. Amy?
I mean, all of these networks, but both newspapers, networks, reaching around the world, input from people all over on social media, email, every which way. But I also think it's important to go, obviously, beyond the networks where most people are getting their news right now. And, that is like, for example, Democracy Now!, which is also a great source of information to go to other places and find all of that, because we're always bringing in and showing sources from all different places. But I just want to highlight, because we're going to be wrapping up soon, how important it is, as you're all saying, to hear the real voices. And just in the last week, it was just so brought home to me with Charlottesville. You had the same pundits on television that you get all of the time who are not very well versed in this. They were the ones commenting. We went deep. We found, the nephew of the white supremacist who marched in Charlottesville, the great-great-grandsons of Stonewall Jackson, both teachers, one in North Carolina and one in Massachusetts, who wrote a letter that said, take down our great-great-grandfather's statue and monuments. This must end. We know what he represented. They were Confederate royalty. When the protests happen in Washington, how many people know it's like Occupy Congress right now? When Congress is in session, hundreds of people are getting arrested. Now, the networks showed the vast images, of the protests in the Senate office buildings. But did you notice there how many people were in wheelchairs? So we bring on the leaders of the movements who are in wheelchairs. They're leading it, like groups like ADAPT. The networks denigrate activists. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? On one day, we had 3 women, one from Denver, 2 from Washington, all 3 in wheelchairs. I had to say they used wheelchairs because with talking heads, you don't even see it. They look like anyone else, and they are like anyone else, except they face great difficulty. I think it changed everyone that day. The woman in Denver who shut down Cory Gardner's office with the other wheelchair users, she said they turned up the heat to make it very difficult for them, the staff of Gardner's office. And then they tried to stop their sit-in by turning off the toilet, so they just added an H to sit-in, and they continued to be there. When the police came to arrest them, they demanded that they tell them how to take apart their wheelchairs. And they said, no, we're resisting arrest. It's not we're not resisting, but we're not going to help you in giving you a guide to how to deal with our wheelchairs. And as this woman, Kellen Heffernan, said, an amazing woman, they then wheeled her into the police wagon that was accessible because she and her colleagues from the 70s had fought to make mass transit accessible. And so the police wagon was made accessible too.
Fantastic.
But to hear those voices, the creativity, the ingenuity, and no one can challenge it.
Two more quick questions, and we're going to take questions from the audience briefly. For Nicholas, I want to ask you, what's something you're teaching or you're overseeing the teaching of to your students at Columbia School of Journalism that you weren't teaching 25 years ago?
Oh, a lot, almost everything. There's some eternal verities, but there's a lot of new stuff. I mean, this picks up on something I think you were asking before. So Joseph Pulitzer was the founder of the school and gave this big gift to Columbia in 1903 to start the school. When immediately there was a reaction from journalists, which was hostility. And so Pulitzer had to defend himself, and he wrote a wonderful essay in 1904 about the School of Journalism. And one thing he says very grandly in the essay is, I will never permit anything about the business side of journalism to be taught in my school, because that would lower and demean the students. They shouldn't have to think about those things. Well, on my watch as dean, we started teaching a mandatory course on the history of journalism and a mandatory course on the economics of journalism, because, I grew up on the idea that, just do your job and everything's going to be fine, and it turned out that everything wasn't fine, and you need to have some context. So that's one of and then the other, quickie is just endless amounts of digital stuff that we didn't teach 15 years ago.
Well, ethically, what do you teach them? Is there anything ethically you teach them that's different?
We try. Actually, we started, right when I was starting as dean, a case study program where we'd go out and do cases, we'd research them and write them up to give people, put them inside the ethical choices that leaders in the profession have to make. So we built up a wonderful library of cases, and one of the very first ones was what became the movie Spotlight, because the guy who wrote the case then became the screenwriter of the movie, and the rest is history. So we do a lot of that kind of stuff too. Everybody has to take an ethics course.
My last question before we take questions from the audience is for Bob, and that is that I'm of the belief, and you can comment on this as well. I'm of the belief that even years ago when he was younger and maybe a little bit more in the game, if you will, that if a major network went to Noam Chomsky and invited him to become a contributor to the evening news on any one of the three networks, the three major networks, and then the fourth eventually when Fox came. But even going back before there was a Fox, I don't think that he had the time or the interest in doing that kind of thing. That it's like the presidency. The people that would make the best president, the people that would make the best public officials want nothing to do with the job. And the people that would make the best journalists want nothing to do with the job, or to some degree. I want you to comment on that. And number two, who's someone in mainstream broadcast media? We can talk about the four majors, including Fox, and even throw in PBS, although I tend to think of PBS as the equivalent of like Luchow's on 14th Street now. It's an old antique, and that's only because of their marketing budget. There's great people on there, but PBS isn't spending any money, by the way. They don't have it to market that show. Who do you admire in mainstream broadcast media still, if anybody?
I'm embarrassed to tell you, I don't watch a lot of broadcast media. I watch as much cable as I have to.
Then let's say cable.
I pay no attention to the evening news broadcasts because I just think they're
Let's go with cable.
Marginal. Cable, I despise Fox for its Foxness. I'm suspicious of MSNBC for its sort of doctrinaire qualities. I despise, above all, CNN for false advertising, because there's just, unless there is actually a war breaking out right now, there is no news there. It's just these battling pundits, and it's infuriating. But I would have to say a single personality, it would be Shepard Smith.
Why?
Because he is the sole voice of reason and sanity and some sort of, moral baseline at Fox News Channel. He's the only one in the whole shop or one of the few in the shop who will speak truth to power, who will say the emperor is naked, and will call out the president of the United States or one of his own colleagues for, one outrage or another. And, I'm not saying he has made a huge difference in political discourse in this country, but it makes me think that maybe somewhere there is hope.
Do you think there is hope?
No, I don't think there's any hope.
Can we bring up the lights even halfway so we can ask our guests here, our patrons here? We have a few minutes to ask a few questions. I can't see if it's a man or a woman there. Stand up, please, and we'll hand you a mic. Can we get a mic over here? Do we have a mic?
Yeah.
Here we go.
I'm a judge of the James Aronson Awards for Social Justice Journalism. This year, of our roughly 8 to 9 awards, more than half were executed by investigative journalism units funded by foundations. ProPublica, I guess, is the most common one, and I'm wondering what the panel thinks. They do wonderful investigative work, and I'm wondering what the panel thinks of their work and also of their economic base, which is by and large philanthropy made on the backs of, well, you know where philanthropy comes from.
Can I take that?
Yes, Bob.
I would say ProPublica does remarkable things, and the foundation-based or donor-based business model is one of the few things that is propping up some serious journalism. However, there is a finite amount of noblesse oblige in the world, and ProPublica has to fight with the Metropolitan Opera and public radio and the Cancer Society and everybody else to get its little slice, and most of these they're not sustaining funders. They are 1 year, 2 year, 3 year projects, and they've got to go out and dig up more. So it's not the best, most secure business model to have. And the second thing is, it's great to have ProPublica and other organizations taking on these large national issues, but where journalism is really wanting is actually in local communities. The state houses are virtually uncovered. The local sewage treatment board is uncovered. The courthouse, uncovered. And, the government is being left to its own devices all across the country. And there's no infrastructure for doing the nuts and bolts journalism that we need as citizens. So God bless them, and congratulations on your awards.
Right. And
But it's not the solution.
I want to say what you just said is interesting, because I've had a warm spot in my heart for a certain publication, primarily because of that section of their paper that they do cover the state house, which is the Los Angeles Times, and the way they cover Sacramento. The Los Angeles Times, over the arc of the many years that I've read the paper and lived in LA and lived here and commuted back and forth, I've always admired deeply the LA Times' commitment to
I've got to add one
Sacramento
tiny thing. I was reviewing a couple years ago, I don't know if anybody saw the Doris Kearns Goodwin book about Theodore Roosevelt. So I was reading it, and she mentions the number of reporters covering Albany when Theodore Roosevelt was governor. And I called my friend Rex Smith, who's the editor of the Albany paper, Columbia J School grad, and said, how many reporters cover this, state capital in Albany? So it's fewer than when Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York today. That's what's happened.
What does that say about Andrew Cuomo? Anyway, over here on this far right side there.
Hi. I just wonder, how do you feel about having a panel to talk about fair news when the four of you are basically liberals?
I just want to say for the record, I'm not a liberal like they're liberals. I mean, they're real liberals. I'm liberal, you know what I mean?
And I came for the buffet, so
We're having a swell dinner across the street in about 20 minutes. So.
but it's a fair question.
Well, I didn't put together the panel, but I would say I've spent 40 plus years as a journalist, and it's a little bit like, I have a colleague at Columbia who's the dean of the social work school, and if you went to him and said, "There's no conservatives at the Columbia School of Social Work," you'd be right. There's certain professions that attract a certain type of person, and although there are conservative journalists, I've known a lot of them, they're more on the opinion side than on the reporting side, and this sort of passion you heard from Amy, which has been around in journalism on its better days for 125 years, is generally associated with a more sort of liberal crusading mentality, and that's the sociology of our profession.
And I want to add something to that, which is last year when we did this, we cast. I don't want to use that word. We booked Bill O'Reilly to come, and just as there was recently, this was the sex scandal before the most recent sex scandal. The sex scandal just before the most recent sex scandal, Bill opted out of the show. Bill O'Reilly was booked, and Monica Crowley very kindly came in and filled in for Bill O'Reilly. So, and then on this show, we invited, we invited, no. What? Tucker Carlson. No, but my point is I want to be very clear, and I'm sure you ask your question with good intentions, although it doesn't come across that way, by the way. What I want to say that we bend over backwards to kind of vary the panels. We bend over backwards. Let me repeat. We bend over backwards. I got a lot of other things to do with my time than call Tucker Carlson for the 6th time and the 7th time and plead with him to come. And let's have a round of applause for the 3 people who did answer our phone call and decided to come. We ask a lot of, and by the way, the people who have, in my estimation, and I'm the one that's producing the program, so screw you if you don't like it. My take on this is that I'm bringing people who have a certain kind of credentials, and most, not all, of the conservatives who have the similar credentials, they're dead. Bill Buckley's dead. So the people that I think are on this footing with them, the conservatives don't have that many left anymore. Yes, ma'am. But it's good to hear from you, by the way. Thank you. Good to hear from you. Go right ahead.
Great panel. I was literally saved by a reporter at the New York Times. It was a local story. I loved the Times before that happened, but it's because I read the Times and I know you guys so well, and of course I read the New Yorker, but I know you guys so well. Gave me the guts to make the call. Very hard to reach you. Very hard to get to your producers. Very hard to have you see the story or hear. I work in a school, we're a K-8 school. I often wonder why you guys don't really make some kind of a setup that gets an 8th grader or even high school kids. Take them to Albany, show them the ropes, give them a one story, follow through, cover it in your piece, and let them do a school newspaper.
What's your question?
My question is, access to you all. Very difficult for the next generation.
So let me talk a little about Democracy Now! For a minute. I don't know how many of you listen, watch, or read Democracy Now!, but we're on public television radio stations around the world, 1,400 of them. A station a week is picking us up. This morning I just left the show where we had college students from around the country in. The show every day or every week, students come who are 4th graders, college students, high school kids, mid-career journalists from everywhere from Macedonia to Iraq to Japan. And every day we after our show, the guests talk to students, we talk to students, we talk about whether you're going to be a journalist or not, how media is made and how important it is to be educated consumer of news. It's absolutely critical, but also to reach out in all sorts of, digital ways as well. And it's really important not to be just in one place. As a lot of news is folding, democracy now is growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, increasingly on stations, but also online, millions of people accessing our information. We're also translated into Spanish every day. And it is really important, I think, the reason there's this kind of excitement about it is because when we go to a protest, we don't do what CNN does. They do go to the protest now, but they walk along in the midst of the protesters. They say, we're walking down 44th Street. We're making a right on 11th Street. Who needs the traffic? We're asking you to just hand the mic over. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society.
In the back, please. Way in the back.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Leila, and I'm a human rights lawyer, so I work with politicians, I work with lawmakers around the world. And being European, I always had the idea that the news we watch should be facts, right? You turn it on in our countries in Europe, and it's basically the main facts. But I also learned that, and it made me think of the book, We Are Amusing Ourselves to Death, that the facts are not so interesting to people. So the media here makes much more money by showing a much more opinionated story than by presenting the facts. And I wanted to know your opinion. How do you feel about, let's say, for example, CNN? As Amy said, they are fighting kind of a personal war with the current president. And although I'm liberal, when I'm watching it, it makes them almost less credible for me because I feel like you're not really presenting me the facts. You're defending yourself. How do you feel about that?
May I? Yep. Wrong. Look, it is true that the president has attacked CNN. It's one of his favorite targets. The failing New York Times, the fake news CNN, and so forth. And Amy asserted that the reason CNN and others are fighting back is because we take it personally. We don't like having our integrity impugned, and therefore we're going to all of a sudden get tough. No. What has happened is that this is an administration so untethered from reality, so outrageous, so erratic, so dishonest, I think I used the word before, so morally depraved that their actions is what is triggering the kind of journalistic backlash to their various the canards that they dish out every single day. So what you're seeing, it is not opinionation. What you're seeing is people who are in the facts business trying to deal with the fact that what's coming from the White House is not fact. And that's not opinion. Calling out a lie for a lie is not an opinion. I know, who was it who said you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts? Was that Moynihan? And that's what's happening every single day. So it is true that it's a lot cheaper to go on and have a panel on prime time opinionating about the news, and the profits are rich. But I don't think that is the phenomenon that you are witnessing in the reaction to the Trump administration. And the bonus is they are so outrageous that that audiences which have kind of tuned out the media are suddenly tuning back in. And a lot of what they see is theatrics, a lot of what they see is bombastic, but they are also beginning to see where the light is shining in the dark areas of an administration are suddenly transparent to all. The net of this, I believe, no matter what damage they do to American society in the time that they are in office, the net of it all will be a more engaged and informed electorate.
I think they agree with you that Trump will galvanize Americans and voters in a way that's never been seen since Vietnam in the 60s. And Larissa McFarquhar in the New Yorker had a wonderful article where she goes down to West Virginia and she interviews these people down there about Trump, and they've got these horrific pictures in barbershops of Obama, I mean, ugly, defaced pictures of Obama and Hillary and pinstripes and bars and throw Hillary in jail. And it's as caustic, it's as mean-spirited as it's ever gotten in this Trump era, and this is a pretty ugly era. And she goes down there and she's talking to some guy who was like, I think he was a professor at a community college. He said, you don't understand. He said, when you're from down here, you're constantly having to weather people's opinion of us down here. You know, do you, and he quotes, he says, do you sleep with your sister? And are those your real teeth in your head? And do you wear shoes? And he says, we don't really believe in Trump necessarily, but we know how much you hate Trump. And this is our chance to give the middle finger to the rest of the country. And I thought, now Trump is the first president of the United States who is really just a bile conductor. He channels people's hate, and this is why we're in the situation where they're in. People who voted for him believed from a television show, from a very successful television show, with a long-running television show, they believe he was this crack executive that you see on that show. Whereas in New York, I'm not going to say Trump was a punchline. I'll never say that, but Trump was a cipher. No, but Trump is a New Yorker to the marrow. He's from Queens, for fuck's sake. And he lives here and he builds buildings here and no one in New York knows Trump. Nobody. He is a very, very furtive and kind of shadowy figure in New York society. We have somebody that was up top. Now go ahead and shout it. No, we're okay. Don't worry about the mic. Don't. It'll take too long. Go ahead. What is your question?
The question is, I'd like to hear the members speak to the growing interest and attention that has been given to things such as Breitbart and Breitbart News. If you would mind speaking to that.
I do want to add, thank you. I do want to add, by the way, that you are the beneficiary of what I call the balcony effect, which is your question and your presentation is so much more powerful because you're speaking from the balcony. Thank you very much. Well done. Well played. Go ahead. Breitbart.
So I want to say this is not the simplest issue. So let's go back to little Alex and his dad watching Huntley Brinkley. So at that point, we as a country decided we don't want to have open Pandora's box and let everybody have a voice on broadcast media. That doesn't sound like a good society to us, so we're not going to have that. Then, you know, for many good reasons, and this was people on the left and the right were part of this, we said, let's open up more. You know, when we make cable and set the rule book for cable, and then when we make the internet and set the rule book for the internet, we want to have a system where anybody can say anything they want and anybody can listen to anything they want. And so you get a much, much greater diversity of voices, and they're not all going to be voices that you like. We went from a very regulated and closed system that silenced a lot of people to a system that gives everybody a voice. And the one unanticipated consequence of that was how many right-wing voices it would empower. Another unanticipated consequence was that you'd have essentially two giant corporations, Google and Facebook, that are the place where the discourse takes place. So we said, we don't want government to regulate speech. We want Google and Facebook, private companies owned by billionaires, to regulate speech. If we don't like what's on the internet, yeah, let them fix the problem, because it's not legitimate for government and politics to fix the problem. So we live in a complicated world with a lot of good and a lot of bad, and it's the world we wanted.
And another thing I want to add is, listen, for people who think we have a liberal panel and so forth, I'm somebody who I think this country needs that political diversity. Just to simplify it in more traditional terms, we need two parties or more. We need a strong Republican Party in this country, because if liberals run the whole thing, we're fucked. I don't believe in that. I don't want the Democrats to sweep every election. I think that having two parties and I'd love to see some stronger independent candidacies like Bernie Sanders, because I think that this is what this country needs. And that's one of the things, the subsidiary things I find so abhorrent about Trump, is he's going to scuttle that party. That party could be in trouble for the next 30 years because of his behavior and the way he's treated the people in that party. We have time for one more question. And actually, we'll make two more questions. We're going to go, I like to go what I call boy-girl here. And we'll have you, sir, over there. And then we're going to have, have you got a good question?
I hope it's a good one. First, I want to compliment the panel and the moderator. And here's an abrasive proposition I'd like your opinion on. That all news is fake news, including fake news.
Amy, is all news fake news?
I don't understand that question, so I'm just going to make a different point.
Amy for president, everyone.
No, I just want to give a warning because of what's happening tonight. President Trump will be giving that speech around the military in Afghanistan. You're going to hear across the political spectrum on the networks, you're going to hear, finally, there are adults in the room, right? You have General Kelly, who's the chief of staff. You have General Mattis, who's the Secretary of Defense. You've got H.R. McMaster, National Security Advisor. What do all those people have in common? They are generals. And we have to, we were talking about the new normal. Most people think that now the Pentagon should be run by a general, but remember, Mattis had to get a waiver for this. We believe in a democratic society. Civilians should be in control. Now you have the president, his family members, and generals. And all of this has to be seriously questioned. We cannot allow them also to redefine general news, because soon there won't be a kernel of truth in it.
Go ahead, Bob.
I got to say, I have never been so happy to see generals. And, even though by the end of this evening, not only could we be increasing our force in Afghanistan, we may be at war with North Korea and California.
And Venezuela.
Yeah. I think the gentleman deserves an answer. Look, obviously, every news story is subjectively created. You make choices about who you're going to talk to. You make choices about what they say that you're going to include and what you're going to exclude. You make choices about the thrust of the story. You may have a hypothesis, a premise, which is borne out or not borne out. You may be more argumentative and less intellectually honest. But that last thing is the key. Of course, it's also subjective. But talented journalists and ethical ones have as a central principle intellectual honesty. While they have total control of what is on the other end of that story, if they are doing their job right, they are not being lawyers arguing to make a case, excluding the information that is inconvenient. No, they are trying to look at it as a totality and even-handedly, fair-mindedly broker the facts. So sure, because there is no force of nature that creates news. But when done properly, it's a really great tool for finding out what happened.
And I want to add, when you say about fake news, when you're the president of the United States and it's perceived that you've been propped up by the Russian government to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to balance your books, and you might owe them some favor, and you ask him that question and he says no, That's not true. And you press further to find out. That's not political. That's journalism. That's journalism, when you press further to find. I'm sorry? I'm sorry? I'm sorry. Okay. I thought somebody just said, who cares? Who said, who cares? Get on up here. There's the conservative we've been missing. Come on up here. Just for the last 2 minutes. We have time for one more question. You promised it's a good one. You got a smoking question here. Here we go.
So all of you guys have talked a lot about the polarization that's occurring in the United States and globally. And I was just wondering, assuming you believe the media has a role in helping to sort of cross-pollinate between these echo chambers that have emerged, what form do you see that taking, if at all?
I have to know, what is that accent? Where are you from?
I know. England meets America meets going too much across the pond both ways.
And your shirt says French.
I know, right? I'm just,
Fake news.
Pro-globalization.
I'm sorry, please.
What's the question again?
Able to help cross-pollinate between these polarized echo chambers that have emerged.
Yes. I mean, again, we have to open our microphones to people at the grassroots. I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded like after World War II by a war resister who said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. There are 5 Pacifica stations. The 4th in Houston, Texas, went on the air in 1970 and was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan almost immediately. KPFT in Houston, in the Petro Metro. And why that's important, it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter, blew it to smithereens, they got back on their feet, and the Klan blew it up again. I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is. But I'll broaden it to how dangerous independent media is. Because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's a native elder from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation or an uncle in Afghanistan, it begins to break down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. You begin to understand where someone is coming from. I didn't say agree with it. How often do we even agree with our family members? But it makes it much more likely that you do not want to destroy them. I think that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back.
Your last comment before we say goodnight. Go ahead.
I would say, again, be careful what you wish for. I want to defend polarization. We've spent a lot of this panel sort of trash-talking people like Brian Williams, and, that's... If not having polarization means you have this sort of constrained, centrist discourse, then I don't think we really want that. I think it's at the individual reporter level, as Bob said, it's very, very important to go out and try to understand the other side, try to get rid of the prejudices you bring to a story. But I think there's a lot to be said in a pluralist, democratic society for having polarization.
Let me just, Bob, I do want to say about that, I don't think that we trash talk Brian Williams.
We were praising him, I just didn't hear it right.
No. Actually, what we did is we read quotes of things he said on the air.
Okay.
Just to clarify that for you, Nick, that we read quotes of things he actually said on the air.
Yeah,
Bob?
I meant priapic in a good way.
Yeah, in a non-sexual way. Go ahead, Bob. Your last comment, Bob. Take us out, Bob.
I got nothing for you. I am just thrilled to be surrounded by these folks, and I think that you all had quite a privilege tonight to hear some of these issues hashed out by 3 people who are all, liberals, but we all come at this situation we're in from slightly different perspectives that I think adds some dimension to what we're going through. So I got to say, I was here too, and I had a great time. So thank you.
I just want to say, this is the last of our 3 programs. Hopefully we'll be back next summer. I want to bring out someone, a very special person. Come on here, Tracy Marshall, who co-produced the program with me, and Andrea Grover, who's the executive director of Guildhall. Tracy, thank you so much. Tracy did all the hard work involved in this program. You want to say something?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
So first I want to thank Alec.
Don't bash Brian Williams, please.
I want to thank Alec for agreeing to program this, Tracy Marshall for doing such an expert job on producing, also our panelists and everyone who's turned up for these last 3 weeks. Last year, after the election, when the country felt extremely divided, Marty Cohen and Alec and I wrote a letter to the editor of the East Hampton Star saying that this coming year wasn't going to be business as usual at Guildhall, that we were going to tackle contemporary issues, that we were going to let artists lead us, that we were really embracing this idea that a well-functioning democracy needs the arts. And I feel like we've done that this year. I'm very proud that we had a play, Angry Young Man, which was about immigration. We had the exhibition, The Innocents by Terrence Simon, which was about wrongful conviction. We have the Avedon's America exhibition up right now, which looks at all different types of Americans, from civil rights leaders to women's rights leaders to artists and activists. And this series is one of the programs that I feel most proud of, and I wish it could happen all year round. And I want to thank the very, very brave lead sponsors who had no idea what the content of this would be. So let me thank the Bradring Kaloria Foundation, Donna and Carol Janis, Susan and Stephen Jacobson, Alice Netter, the Hayden Family Foundation, and Alec and Hilaria Baldwin Foundation. Now, if you want some more, on September 9th, we have a one-night staged reading of a play called Are You Now or Have You Ever Been? And it's about the House Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it's going to be directed by Harris Yulin. It has a number of stars in it, including James Earl Jones. So that's on September 9th, and we hope maybe we'll have like a mid-season Hamptons Institute. Okay, thank you so much for the panelists. Thank you to
Please do me one favor, and that is these programs only thrive, these programs only do well, we only accomplish our goals in direct proportion to the response we get from our invitees. Please help me thank Bob Garfield, Amy Goodman, and Nicholas Lemann. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.